Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we turn massive piles of research into distilled, delicious knowledge. Today, we are taking on a topic that sits right at the intersection of philosophy, ethics, and some really cutting-edge neuroscience. Animal consciousness.
Right.
We're talking about that fundamental quality of being aware. Aware of something outside yourself or something inside yourself. Self-awareness, even.
And it is the ultimate boundary question, isn't it? For centuries, this was almost purely a philosophical debate. How can we really know what it's like inside the mind of a non-human? But our mission for this deep dive is to show you how, really in just the last decade or so, science has not just joined the debate, it's completely moved the goalposts.
The whole consensus has shifted radically.
And the implications are, well, they're enormous.
But the challenge, right out of the gate, it's still philosophical, isn't it? It's this problem of other minds.
Exactly. That's the foundation of all of this. In philosophy, it's the question of how you can be certain that any mind other than your own has a subjective, conscious experience.
With other people, we just sort of assume.
We assume. We use language. We see shared behaviors. We know our brains are built the same way. But with animals, that problem is just exponentially harder.
Because they can't tell us.
They can't tell us what they're feeling in human language. So we're forced to infer everything through these clever proxies, which is always, filled with potential for error.
And historically, it's been pretty convenient to just deny consciousness altogether. It's kind of an ethical shortcut.
A huge one. And you have to look at someone like René Descartes back in the 17th century.
The animal machine guy.
The animal machine guy. Mm-hmm. He promoted this mechanistic model. He basically claimed that animals were just complex biological automata.
Like robots made of meat.
Precisely. They looked like they were feeling pain, they looked like they had emotions, but he argued you could explain all of it mechanically. You didn't need a conscious soul or a mind. Only humans had that.
And the ethical gravity of that is just immense.
It is. It gives you permission to treat animals as objects.
Right.
If you can successfully argue an animal isn't conscious, that it doesn't really feel pain or suffer, well, then it follows that its life has no moral value in the way a human life does.
So harming them isn't wrong.
It isn't morally wrong. And this is why these new scientific declarations are so important. They are a direct challenge to centuries of that kind of ethical rationalization.
But the core of the problem, the thing that really crystallized the sheer unknowability of it all, was Thomas Nagel's essay from '74.
Oh. What is it like to be a bat?
Exactly.
It's still so influential. Nagel's argument is beautifully simple, but also really profound. He says, an organism is conscious if and only if there is something that is like to be that organism.
Something it is like for the organism.
Yeah. Yes, and the problem he points out is that we can never, ever get outside of our own human perspective.
You can learn everything about a bat's brain, how echolocation works, the physics of it. You can even try to, hang upside down in a dark room.
But you'll only ever know what it's like for a human to simulate being a bat. You'll never know the subjective, phenomenal experience of navigating the world as a three-dimensional tapestry of sound.
Which is their reality.
It is. And Nagel just forces us to accept that that subjective world might be fundamentally inaccessible. So science has to look for objective markers of subjectivity.
Which brings us to the definitional mess.
The mess, yeah.
Before you can measure it, you have to define it, and defining consciousness seems like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
It is remarkably ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Our sources point out there's something like 40 different meanings for the term.
40.
Depending on if you're talking about memory or function or awareness. Even as recently as 2004, you had top neuroscientists saying a precise definition was, and I'm quoting here, premature.
Yeah.
They just hadn't mapped the brain enough.
Okay, so if consciousness is too big and messy, we have to break it down into parts we can actually measure. So let's start at the bottom. The most basic requirement.
That would be sentience. This is the minimal definition. It's just the ability to feel, to perceive, to have subjective experiences. It's the raw capacity for an inner life.
So if a creature is sentient, it's not just a robot reacting. There's something going on inside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the specific things going on inside.
The actual feelings.
Those are qualia. That's the fancy philosophical term for the individual instances of subjective experience. Not the ability to feel, but the specific feeling itself. The redness of red, the sting of a burn.
If sentience is the operating system, qualia are the little data packets running on it.
That's a great way to put it. And then at the very top of the pyramid, you have the thing we usually think of.
Self-reflection.
Self-awareness. the capacity to look inward, to recognize yourself as an individual, an I that's separate from the world around you.
This is a lot to juggle. Is there a framework to help organize this?
There is. The late neuroscientist Gerald Edelman gave us a really useful one. He broke it down into two distinct levels of consciousness. He starts with primary consciousness. You can think of this as sensory consciousness. It's simple awareness. It's the ability to take in what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and integrate it with your immediate memory to create an awareness of the right now.
The immediate present?
The immediate present. An animal with primary consciousness knows what's happening in its direct sensory world. We think most animals have this, from your dog to maybe even a foraging ant.
Okay, but I have to jump in there. If it's just about knowing the immediate present, isn't that what a sophisticated AI does? I mean, a self-driving car is aware of its immediate surroundings, it tracks objects, it integrates sensory data. How do we know it's felt in an animal and not just advanced programming?
That is the perfect question. And that is the exact challenge that Edelman's second level tries to address.
Okay.
Secondary consciousness. This is what helps separate true subjective experience from just complex behavior. It's a much higher form. It involves self-reflection, abstract thought, and critically, access to your own personal history and the ability to make plans for the future.
So it's mental time travel. You can reflect on your past and project yourself into the future.
Precisely. This lets you go beyond the limits of that remembered present. Now, in its richest, most linguistic form, it might be unique to humans, but it's clearly present in animals that show advanced problem solving. Great apes, and as we'll see, some birds. The key difference is that secondary consciousness requires an internal model of the self who is doing the awareness.
Right. So philosophy gets stuck on what's it like to be a bat. So scientists have to find ways to measure this stuff with empirical data.
Exactly. We need tools. In humans, we rely on three things: verbal reports, behavior, and looking at the brain neural correlates. With animals, verbal reports are out. So we have to get really inventive with the behavioral tests.
And the most famous and maybe most criticized of those tests is the mirror test?
The mirror test, or the mark test, Gordon Gallup Jr. came up with it in the 70s to try and get its self-recognition.
The method is pretty simple, right?
Very straightforward. You put a mark, some dye or paint, on an animal while it's sedated, somewhere they can't see it on their own body. Then you wake them up, show them a mirror. If they look at their reflection, and then start touching or rubbing the mark on their own body,
then they pass. They recognize that the thing in the mirror is them.
They've made the connection.
And the A-listers who pass are pretty much who you'd expect. The great apes, chimps, orangutans, and then big-brained social animals like elephants, dolphins, killer whales. But the real game changer, the result that turned neuroscience on its head, was the magpie.
Oh, absolutely. The 2008 magpie study was a genuine shock to the system because it just completely blew up the reigning theory at the time.
This neocortex fallacy.
Exactly. The fallacy was this assumption that self-recognition, and really any high-level consciousness, was restricted to mammals with a big layered neocortex.
But birds don't have one of those. Their brains are structured totally differently.
Totally differently. Their intelligence comes from a dense structure called the pallium. And the magpie result proved that the brain parts that mammals and birds inherited from their last common ancestor evolved down two completely separate paths to achieve the exact same complex cognitive feat.
So it proved it's about the function, not the specific structure.
That's the key. It was the first clear, non-mammalian proof that there's more than one way for a brain to produce self-awareness.
And the controversy just keeps going, right? Down the evolutionary tree. What about that fish, the cleaner wrasse?
That is a fantastic example of the limits of the test itself. So this small reef fish, the cleaner wrasse, was the first fish ever reported to pass the mirror test. They put a mark on them, and they saw the fish trying to scrape the mark off on rocks and coral, but only after looking in the mirror.
It seems like it checks all the boxes.
It does, but the criticism came immediately, and it was profound.
From the test's inventor, no less.
Right, Gallup himself argued that this is what cleaner wrasse do. They clean parasites off other fish. So he said maybe the fish just saw what it thought was a parasite on another fish, its reflection, and was just doing its instinctual parasite scraping thing.
So is it recognizing itself or just seeing another fish with a thing on it?
That's the question. Now, the study's authors pushed back. They said the sequence of the behavior mattered. The wrasse would check the mirror, go scrape, then come back and check the mirror again. That pattern suggests they knew the reflection was their own body.
It's still being debated.
It is. But it highlights the biggest flaw of the mirror test.
Hmm.
It is profoundly anthropocentrically visual. It's a test for animals that, like us, rely on sight for identity.
If you're a creature whose world is built on smell, you're gonna fail.
You're going to fail even if you're fundamentally self-aware.
Which brings us to dogs.
Yes, dogs. They fail the mirror test miserably. And yet I don't think anyone who lives with a dog has any doubt that they are conscious beings.
Right. They just don't care what they look like.
They're not visual in that way. Their primary sense is smell, olfaction. So to get around this bias, a study in 2015 came up with the sniff test of self-recognition.
Okay, how does that work?
They gave dogs urine samples. One was their own fresh sample, one was from another dog, and the last one, this is the clever part, was their own sample, but it had been slightly altered with a new scent.
And you just watch how long they sniff each one.
Exactly. Their own fresh urine. They barely sniffed it. They recognized it as me and moved on. The other dog's urine, lots of investigation. But the altered me sample, they spent way more time sniffing that one.
Which suggests they recognized it as their own scent, but also noticed something was different.
It's evidence of self-awareness, but using their primary sense.
Yeah.
And the takeaway for you, the listener, is just so important here. When we see differences between species, it might just be the limits of our tests, not the limits of the animal.
Okay, so that's physical self-recognition. But what about getting inside their heads? How they're feeling? Are they an optimist? Are they a pessimist?
To measure those internal emotional states, those affective states, scientists use a concept called cognitive bias.
The glass half full, glass half empty idea?
That's it, exactly. But applied to animals.
How on earth do you test for optimism in a rat? Or a honeybee?
You train them. You teach an animal, say a rat, that a high-pitched tone means something good is coming, like a food pellet, and a low-pitched tone means something negative, or maybe nothing at all.
So you train them on the two extremes.
You train them on the extremes, then you hit them with an ambiguous cue, a tone that's right in the middle.
And you see what they do.
If the rat is feeling optimistic in a glass half-full state, it will run to the food spot predicting a good outcome. If it's feeling pessimistic or anxious, it will hesitate or avoid it.
That's brilliant. It's a quantifiable, objective measure of a subjective state.
And it works. It's been used successfully on this incredible range of species: rats, dogs, sheep, starlings, even honeybees. And they found that you can influence it. Give rats an enriched, happy environment, they become more optimistic. Isolate them, they become more pessimistic.
So you can directly link their environment to their measurable emotional state.
You can.
Okay, that's emotion. Let's push it one step further. The idea of knowing that you know.
Metacognition. Cognition about cognition. It's the ability to monitor your own certainty, to know when you're sure about something and when you're just guessing. It's fundamental for higher level thinking.
And where have we seen real proof of this in animals?
The best evidence comes from rhesus monkeys and great apes. Researchers gave them tasks where, if they weren't sure of the answer, they could choose to opt out of the trial.
The I don't know button.
The I don't know button. And they found that the harder the task, the more often the animals would choose to opt out and avoid a penalty for guessing wrong. This showed they weren't just guessing. They were actively monitoring their own internal state of knowledge.
And what about, say, rats?
They tried. There were some studies in the mid-2000s that looked promising. But when they dug into the data, it seemed like you could explain the rat's behavior with simpler conditioning.
What's the difference there? I mean, functionally, what's the difference between true metacognition and just complex conditioning?
It's about reflection. With true metacognition, the monkey is thinking, in a sense, I'm not sure about this memory, so I'll hit the odd God button.
Okay.
With a conditioning model, the rat isn't thinking about its memory. It's just learned a rule. When the cue is fuzzy, the I don't know button gives me a small, guaranteed treat, which is a better bet than risking a punishment. It's maximizing its reward based on external cues, not reflecting on its internal doubt.
Which just shows how hard it is to be sure you're measuring what you think you're measuring.
It's incredibly difficult.
And all of this detailed science is what finally led to this huge paradigm shift. Because for so long, we had that neocortex fallacy. People like James Rose in the early 2000s arguing you needed that specific mammalian brain structure to have complex feelings.
That was the absolute conventional wisdom. Rose argued that a fish, for example, might recoil from an injury, but that was just a non-conscious reflex because it didn't have a neocortex. The actual conscious feeling of pain, he said, had to be cortical.
But then neuroscientists started looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCCs, outside of the cortex.
And that was the revolution. The NCC is the minimum brain activity you need for a specific conscious experience. And the old view was that it had to be in the neocortex. But now we have overwhelming evidence that animal consciousness can come from homologous subcortical brain networks.
Homologous meaning structures we share from a common ancestor. Which deep brain structures are we talking about?
We're talking about ancient structures that all vertebrates have. Things of the brainstem, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. For instance, there's a part of the brainstem called the periaqueductal gray, or PEG. It's critical for processing things like pain and fear.
So even if you don't have a cortex or it's built differently, you still have these deep, shared emotional centers.
Exactly. And the convergent evidence is stunning. If you use deep brain stimulation on these subcortical areas in humans, you generate basic emotional states: panic, pleasure, rage. And if you stimulate the exact same homologous areas in other animals, you get the exact same behavioral responses.
So the feeling itself is generated deep in the brain. The cortex might add layers of thought and memory to it, but the raw feeling is subcortical.
That seems to be the case. The feeling itself is ancient.
And all this evidence came together in 2012 with this huge public statement, the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness.
That was the scientific community drawing a line in the sand. A group of the world's leading neuroscientists got together and said, unequivocally, non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates for consciousness.
Including birds and octopuses in that first declaration was the really powerful part.
It was. It was an explicit rejection of the idea that you needed a mammalian brain. It confirmed that bird brains, for example, are functionally homologous to ours. They just evolved on a parallel track to achieve the same complex results.
So if Cambridge was the earthquake, then the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness from 2024 was the global aftershock that basically cemented this new reality.
It was a massive expansion. We're talking over 500 scientists signing on. And they didn't just reaffirm that mammals and birds are conscious. That's now considered settled science. They went way further.
Where did they go?
They stated that there is now a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates. That means fish, reptiles, amphibians, and even more radically, in many invertebrates.
So the scientific community is now saying, for these groups, we have enough evidence that we can't ethically ignore the possibility anymore.
That's exactly it. They specifically named cephalopods, like octopuses, decapod crustaceans, so crabs and lobsters, and even insects. Insects, based on growing evidence of complex behavior and pain responses in those groups.
And this leads right back to the ethical point we started with.
It does. The New York Declaration has an explicit ethical mandate. It says when there's a realistic possibility that an animal has conscious experience, it is irresponsible to ignore that possibility in any decision that affects that animal.
So the burden of proof has flipped.
It is completely flipped. We no longer need absolute proof of consciousness to act ethically. The mere possibility now imposes a moral obligation.
Okay, let's dive into some of these non-mammalian minds that are forcing this change. We have to get away from that old idea of the scalinature, the ladder of nature, with us at the top.
That shift is fundamental, and avian intelligence is the best proof of this parallel evolution concept.
So let's start with the corvids, crows, ravens, magpies. They are just shattering all the old assumptions.
They are magnificent. We already know the magpie passed the mirror test. And the reason it can do that without a mammalian cortex is that avian pallium structure we mentioned. It's organized differently into dense clusters instead of layers, but functionally, it's just as powerful. A beautiful case of convergent evolution.
And we got definitive proof of their sensory consciousness just a few years ago.
Yes, that 2020 study on carrion crows. They trained the crows to signal when they saw a flash on a screen. And by monitoring their brains, the scientists found a specific neural response that perfectly correlated with whether the crow perceived the stimulus or not.
So they found a functional marker for subjective perception, a neural correlate of consciousness, but in a bird.
Exactly. Which means either the foundations for conscious perception evolved more than 320 million years ago, before we split from them, or birds evolved it all on their own. Either way, it's not just a mammal thing.
And then there are the gray parrots, where the evidence for that higher-level secondary consciousness is just so strong, mostly thanks to Irene Pepperberg's work with Alex.
Alex is a cornerstone of this field. Pepperberg showed he wasn't just mimicking. He understood abstract concepts: shape, color, number, even relative size. He could identify things based on their absence.
Can you give us a concrete example? Something that shows he wasn't just, following cues.
One of the most famous is the concept of zero or none. He was shown a tray of blocks, all of them blue, and he was asked what color is different, and Alex would say none.
Wow.
He could apply that concept across different categories. If they showed him two identical keys and asked what is different, he'd say none. He got the abstract concept of absence.
That's a level of thinking you really only see in chimps or very young human children.
It is. And it wasn't a one-off. Another parrot, Inkisi, had a vocabulary of over 950 words and would use them creatively. When Jane Goodall came to visit, the parrot looked at her and asked, "Got a chimp?"
That's not a trained phrase.
Not at all. It is a creative connection based on seeing pictures of her work. We've even seen gray parrots collaborate to solve problems and show social preferences for who they want to work with.
Okay, if birds are the parallel evolution argument, let's go to the truly alien minds, invertebrates, specifically octopuses.
Octopuses are just fascinating. Their intelligence is so decentralized. 2/3 of their 500 million neurons are not in their central brain. They're in their arms.
So the arms think for themselves?
Semi-autonomously, yes. An octopus arm can perform incredibly complex actions like navigating a maze, even without direct input from the central brain. They have short and long-term memory, they learn by observation, they can open screw-top jars.
And it's the specific behaviors, the anecdotes, that really suggest an internal world. Things like play and tool use.
Play is a big one. It has no immediate survival function, and we see octopuses in tanks repeatedly dropping toys into a current just so they can catch them again. That suggests curiosity.
But the real kicker is the coconut shell story.
Oh, the veined octopus, yes. Researchers saw them do something incredible, not just using a shell for shelter, but actively collecting discarded coconut shells, carrying them across the seafloor, and then assembling them into a portable shelter when they needed it.
That's not just using a tool, that's planning for a future need.
It's complex tool use that requires foresight and planning. Those are capabilities tied directly to secondary consciousness.
So with all this overwhelming data, the self-aware magpie, the abstract thinking parrot, the coconut-carrying octopus, how do we even start to compare them? How do we get past that simple consciousness ladder?
We need a new map, a multidimensional one. And that's what led to this proposal in 2020 for a multidimensional framework for animal consciousness. It gets rid of that single line, that single continuum.
So instead of asking if an octopus is less conscious than a crow, you look at their different strengths across different axes of awareness.
Exactly. The framework proposes 5 dimensions. First, perceptual richness, how much detail is in their sensory world. A bird with 4 types of color cones scores higher than we do.
Okay.
Second, evaluative richness, the complexity of their emotions. Third is unity. Is their experience integrated into a single perspective? The octopus is a fascinating question here.
Right. Does it have 9 points of view?
Maybe. Fourth is temporality. Do they live in the now, or can they remember the past and plan for the future, like our octopus? And fifth is selfhood, the extent of self-processing, from basic body awareness all the way up to mirror self-recognition.
That feels like a much more honest way to look at it. It lets you compare different types of minds without trying to flatten them onto one human-centric scale.
That's the goal. And it brings us to the main takeaway for you, the learner. The old neocortex-only view is gone. The scientific consensus is that consciousness is widespread. And now our job is to study these different dimensions, accepting that this vast array of non-human species are plausible sentient beings.
Which brings us right back around to where we started, at that philosophical question of function versus feeling. There's that old idea, right? Epiphenomenalism.
Epiphenomenalism.
Yeah.
The idea that consciousness is just a useless byproduct. The philosopher Thomas Henry Huxley compared it to the whistle on a steam locomotive. It makes a noise, but it has no effect on the engine's machinery. The brain does all the work, and the feeling of consciousness just sort of rides along.
But the philosopher William James had a great counter-argument to that, an evolutionary one.
He did. He basically asked, if consciousness does nothing, why would evolution bother to select for it and preserve it for hundreds of millions of years across all these different species?
It must have a survival value. It must do something.
It must be efficacious. It must allow for flexible responses to new situations that a simple reflex can't handle.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to take away from this deep dive. Think about us, about humans. We can learn a complex skill, playing a Beethoven sonata, riding a bike, to the point where it becomes completely automatic. We don't have to consciously think about it at all. So we know that complex adaptive behavior can happen without moment-to-moment conscious oversight.
Right. The behavior is functional, it's automated.
So if the incredible complex behavior we see in all these animals, the octopus with its coconut, the collaborating parrot, already has its own functional survival value, what does William James's point imply for our actions? Does the very existence of that complex survival, honed by millions of years of evolution, already create its own ethical urgency? Regardless of whether we can ever truly answer the question, what is it like to be them?
Perhaps the function is enough to demand our respect, even as we continue the search for the feeling.
We'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.